80,000 years ago, a volcano in Sumatra exploded with such force that it plunged the entire planet into darkness for a year. Humanity was reduced to maybe 26,000 breeding pairs, the whole species, clinging to survival on a handful of islands. And then, one morning, the sun broke through. The survivors who witnessed that moment called it something. And according to one researcher's work, that something became the festival we still celebrate today as Diwali. Welcome to Co-Pilot Podcasts. Today, we are pulling on one of the most audacious threads in the study of human origins, specifically how a supervolcanic catastrophe may have sparked humanity's oldest continuous religious festival, how survivors developed a cartography-based writing system that spread to every continent, and what a priestly practice called solaromancy has to do with Moses, the pyramids, and the Maori. By the end of this episode, you will see ancient iconography, world religion, and even Diwali itself in a completely different light. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start right at the beginning. The eruption itself. Walk me through what actually happened.
So the Toba Super Eruption of 80,000 BC is not a small event we're talking about. The caldera, the mouth of the volcano, was, according to this research, as wide as England and Wales combined. That is a staggering scale. And the volcanic activity, while it eventually subsided, first produced what we'd call a volcanic winter. The skies went dark. The tidal ecologies were destroyed almost instantly. Imagine billions of dead fish washing up on shore. The ash fallout killed most plant species. The researcher describes it as the dead coast of Asia, a red line on the map where the coastline of 80,000 BC simply ceased to support life.
And this is where the 26,000 breeding pairs figure comes in, right? Exactly. The researcher actually uses the current academic consensus figure, 26,000 breeding pairs, and says, fine, let's work with that. Let's accept that as the maximum challenge. All of humanity, essentially, in the hull of what the research describes as an iconographic longboat, a massive earthwork and timber flood control structure at the first major fork of the Kapuas River on Borneo, right at the base of a mountain called Bukit Kelam.
Bukit Kelam, that name keeps coming up in this research. Why is that mountain so central?
Because the researcher argues it is the geographic and symbolic origin point of everything that follows. It's described as a narrow slab of a mountain at the first major fork in the Kapuas River, and it served as the arbitrating court of the patriarch and matriarch of the Archaic Dayak people. The geometry of the mountain itself, the researcher says, made a south-north division of the kindreds inevitable. Two camps formed on either side, what the research calls kindred yin and kindred yang.
So yin and yang, that philosophy we associate with China, the researcher is tracing it back to a literal geographic split on Borneo after a volcanic catastrophe.
That's the argument, yeah. And it gets more specific. The researcher notes that the orca, the killer whale, is central to this iconography in the region, and that Asia's yin-yang contrasting philosophy originates from lessons learned from observing orcas in the waters around Borneo. The fluke of an orca diving beneath the waves is the visual template. It's one of those moments where you think, that's either completely wild or completely obvious, and I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I had that exact reaction reading through this. But let's get to the moment that the research says became Diwali, because that's the one that really stopped me.
Right. So a year after the eruption, the volcanic activity has subsided enough that the skies begin to clear. And what the survivors witnessed in the atmosphere, from the summit of Bukit Kelam, the researcher describes as nothing short of a miracle. What they saw was a sundog.
A sundog. Okay, for people who haven't seen one, what is that?
A sundog is a rare atmospheric phenomenon where ice crystals suspended in the stratosphere reflect sunlight, creating what looks like additional suns or halos flanking the actual sun, usually low on the horizon at sunrise. They're rare today because our atmosphere is much drier. But in the aftermath of Toba, the upper atmosphere was saturated with volcanic gases and particulates, sulfur oxides, sulfuric species, and the researcher argues these would have compounded the effect dramatically. Not just the 4 prominences that water ice crystals produce, but potentially 8, what the research calls a Mogan 9, a sundog with 8 constituent flares on its periphery.
So you'd have this elaborate, almost geometric halo of light around the sun, appearing in the sky after a year of darkness.
Compounded by a full rainbow. And here's where it gets philosophically interesting. The researcher points out that in the popular imagination, a rainbow is a half arc above the ground. But the rainbows the research references are complete circles. And the researcher makes this observation about Irish legend, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Every generation tries to find the end of a half-arc rainbow and never can. But if the rainbow is a full circle, its end is its center. And the center of a circular rainbow is the sun. The pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is the sun.
Wait, that's actually a beautiful piece of logic. And the researcher says Irish wisdom and Hindu wisdom on this vary not one whit between them. Exactly. And that convergence is kind of the whole point. The researcher argues that this atmospheric phenomenon, the divine bow, as Arabian canon calls it, the bow of Shiva in Hindu canon, the mandala, was witnessed by survivors across different latitudes in different proportions, but recognized everywhere as the same sacred sign. And the day it appeared, the day light overcame the darkness, became mankind's oldest continuous religious festival. The name of that festival, the researcher states plainly, is Diwali.
That is a claim that would make a lot of historians sit up very straight in their chairs.
It would. And the researcher is aware of that. The framing throughout is, look, modern academia dismisses all these religious narratives as ignorant superstition. But the researcher asks, how could any cultural narrative begin in anything other than darkness and chaos if this is where cultural memory actually begins? Both science and religion agree mankind descended from a single father and mother. Evolutionary scientists even call them genetic Adam and genetic Eve. The disagreement is over the disaster narrative, and the researcher's position is that the disaster narrative is not superstition, it's memory.
And the maps, the researcher keeps saying, I have maps. That's the evidence base. Right. The maps all lead back to Bukit Kelam on Borneo. That's the claim. And it's what leads into the second major thread of this research, which is iconographic writing. Because the maps aren't modern maps, they're encoded in what the researcher calls an iconographic writing system that was in use on every continent before 1500 BC.
Okay, so let's dig into that, because this is where the research gets genuinely surprising. What is iconographic writing, and how is it different from what we normally think of as ancient writing?
So the researcher, who publishes under the name An Unknown Soldier, crediting US Armed Forces training with making the discovery possible, deciphered this writing system in 2011, starting with a stone artifact in Cardiff, Wales, called the Bryn Cethli Thi pattern stone. The key distinction is this: conventional writing modulates verbal information. Iconographic writing modulates visual information. It's a markup language for geography.
So it's not encoding sounds or words, it's encoding places.
More than that, the researcher identifies 3 rules of syntax. Rule 1, the composition had to look like the realm it documented, borders and details based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. This, the researcher says, explains all the fantastic headdresses of archaic rulers. If your kingdom's geology looked like a pin-tailed duck, the head of your king was depicted as a man with a pin-tailed duck's head. Rule 3, every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, in geophysical relationship to each other.
So Egyptian gods with animal heads, Horus with the falcon head, that's not mythology, that's a map.
That's the argument. The researcher found that the geology of Egypt west of the Nile resembles a perched Egyptian black kite, facing east, wings tucked, claws clutching the upper Nile. Horus originates in that geology. And then the researcher asks, why are the Great Pyramids of Giza located exactly where they are? Because in iconographic compositions, the nose of the figure is always the sovereign's mountain, the high point from which the king reigns. Egypt's Nile Delta had no natural mountain, so they built one. The pyramids sit precisely on the nose of Horus.
That is one of those ideas that sounds completely outrageous, and then you can't unsee it.
The researcher says exactly that about the Dama de Elche, a famous carving from Spain dated to around 400 BC, long thought to be a Carthaginian funerary urn. When you put it in profile next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal, the researcher describes it as nearly irrefutable. The carving is a map. These compositions are not art, they are, in the researcher's words, constitutions. Documents detailing the structure and function of archaic societies.
And the same system shows up in pre-Roman Britain, the Dayak shields of Borneo next to Celtic shields of Britain being nearly identical in form and function.
Yes. The researcher places a regalia shield of pre-Roman Britain next to a regalia shield of the Dayak of Borneo and says, in both form and function, these are nearly identical. And explaining how and why, the researcher says, is the greatest privilege of their life. The curvilinear conventions originating in Borneo form a morphology of iconography that varies little in meaning at its furthest extent.
So the writing system traveled from Borneo outward across the entire world.
That's the claim. And the researcher traces the mechanism of that spread through the island hopping of the kindred yin and kindred yang after the eruption. Remember, ocean levels were 45 meters lower in 80,000 BC. Borneo and Palawan were very nearly connected. The kindred yang hopped north to Palawan, the kindred yin went south to Tawi-Tawi Island, and from there opened access to the entire Philippine archipelago. The researcher identifies the easternmost reaches of the Philippines, specifically the tallest mountain on the Isle of Catanduanes, as the new court of the patriarch and matriarch, the Kingdom of Catanduanes.
And the researcher is careful to say, this isn't just about Indonesia. Survivors in India, Arabia, Africa, they all faced the same catastrophe.
Right. The Dead Coast wasn't limited to Asia. But the researcher's argument is that among Indonesia's survivors, iconographic writing was maintained as a tradition. The Dayak of Archaic Indonesia kept the record, others did not. And eventually, the researcher argues, the Dayak went on to re-civilize the world, and survivors elsewhere adopted the protocols of Dayak nobility.
Now, before we get to soloromancy, which I genuinely cannot wait to talk about, I want to pause on the 5 universal glyphs, because the researcher identifies these as the building blocks of the whole system.
Yes. Through what the researcher calls cluster analysis, 5 glyphs were found to be universally employed in iconographic compositions on every continent prior to 1500 BC. The gyre, most frequently found, then the circle, then the ellipse, then the Y-glyph, and the lotus. And the researcher shows how these are all implicit in the geography of any island. The circle is the island itself. The Y-glyph is the first major fork on every river. The ellipse is the kindred longboat, the community established at every major fork. The spiral path leading to the summit of the highest mountain completes the composition into what the researcher calls a jar.
So the writing system is literally derived from the shape of the land. You look at an island and the glyphs are already there.
Exactly. And the lotus is particularly significant because it wasn't just an iconographic symbol, it was survival. The researcher describes the lotus as manna from heaven in those dark days after Toba. It thrives in low-light, nutrient-dense waters. Every part of it is edible. When everything else was dying, the lotus bloomed in the ash-laden pools of Borneo, so it became simultaneously food and sacred symbol.
That's a remarkable convergence. The thing that kept you alive becomes the thing you use to write with.
And the researcher notes that the iconographic record, by this account, begins in 77,000 BC, following the Toba eruption. Though the researcher also says they wouldn't be shocked if iconographic writing turns out to be over 1 million years old, because the technique is merely an extension of a spear's utility, and spears have been around for many millions of years.
Okay, soloromancy. Let's go there. Because this is the mechanism, this is how the maps actually got made.
So soloromancy is described as an archaic priestly rite of divination. But strip away the religious framing and what you have is a surveying technique of remarkable precision. The researcher says the process is, quote, a snap. You take a staff, any stick, though longer is more accurate, and you plant it upright in the ground. You place a stone on the tip of its shadow. Later in the afternoon, the shadow has moved. You place a stone on the tip of the new shadow. Draw a line between the 2 stones and you have a perfect east to west line, every time. The researcher claims this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
More accurate than GPS? That's a bold claim.
It is. But the logic is that the sun is an absolute frame of reference. You're not triangulating from satellites with orbital drift, you're using the actual solar path. From that east-west baseline, you align your staff to distant landmarks on the horizon and trace the azimuth lines onto a cloth. The researcher describes it as the inside of a robe. Repeat this from multiple vantage points, and the intersecting lines of sight produce a contour map without ever needing to measure distances.
And this is what Moses was doing on Mount Sinai.
According to the researcher, yes. The researcher identifies the peak as Mount Catherine on the Sinai Peninsula, the tallest in the region, and argues it could only have been that peak because soloromancers always sought the highest point. From Mount Catherine, 2 distant ridgelines are visible. The researcher identifies 11 prominent peaks on each. Moses, as an apprentice soloromancer tending flocks through the Sinai, would have spent 40 years surveying the region, measuring azimuths from each pasture, cross-confirming waypoints, building up a map of intersecting lines on his robes.
And the burning bush, the bush that burned with fire and was not consumed, that's the map.
That's the researcher's argument. The phonetic record in Exodus, correlated with the iconography, requires, in the researcher's words, that we accept Moses was in the center of the wadis which form the central trunk of the region he surveyed. The bush that burned but was not consumed is the iconographic record of a soloromancer's survey. The fire is the sun. The bush is the branching pattern of the ridgelines as recorded on the robe. It burns, it is illuminated by solar measurement, but it is not consumed because it is a map, not actual combustion.
I want to sit with that for a second because it's genuinely one of the more mind-bending reframings of a canonical story I've encountered. And the researcher extends this to Arabian regalia, the robes of the Bedouin nobility.
Yes. The researcher looks at the gold border adorning the robes of Arabian nobility, the bisht, and argues that in the Archaic, that border represented the line of solar progress. When the robe is worn, the line of solar progress forms an arc around the wearer's head. When laid flat on the ground, like a prayer rug, it forms a perfect east-to-west line. The agal, the rope headdress, is described as a compass complete with azimuth indicators. The researcher says, dressed in nothing more than a bisht and agal, the Arabian nobility were never lost.
So the most sacred garments of multiple traditions are actually navigation technology.
That's the argument. And the researcher extends it to rugs, suggesting that secrets were recorded on the underside of rugs, disguised as finishing knots. The permanent designs of Bedouin regalia would feature aspects of kindred life that were immutable, the colours, arms, and locations of every kindred court along the Bedouin progress, and temporary stitching could be added to keep track of accounts or new waypoints without harming the integrity of the article.
This is where I want to bring in the Maori moko, because that's the example that really got me. These are the facial tattoos, one of the most personal, intimate art forms in any culture. And the researcher says they're maps.
Nearly all of them, originally, were charts of the ocean currents surrounding New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Sulawesi. The researcher calls Maori moko an advanced lesson in oceanographic iconography and says this is just an introduction. The idea that the most personal marking a human being can carry on their body is actually a navigational chart of the ocean. That's the kind of reframing that makes you look at everything differently.
And it connects back to the ocean navigation piece, the researcher's argument that our ancestors could navigate open ocean not by seeing distant islands, but by reading the clouds above them.
Right. Islands are like cloud farms, the researcher says. Life on islands creates condensation nuclei. Ocean air blows over and forms thick cloud layers above every island for hundreds of miles around. So technically, our ancestors couldn't see the physical coast of distant islands, but daily rafts of cloud flew like flags over every promising island in the ocean. Clouds informed, and seabirds confirmed, land beyond the visible horizon. The researcher calls the academic alternative, that hominins accidentally washed up on distant islands after typhoons, the Gilligan's Island approach to Austronesian colonization.
Ha! That's a good line. And the ocean of milk, the milky, ash-laden waters after Toba, that actually guided survivors toward the clear water route between Taiwan and the Philippines.
Yes. The prevailing ocean currents flushed the ash fallout north, leaving the Philippine and Indonesian archipelago with clear seas. The researcher documents the boundary between the ash-laden milky ocean and the clear water, and argues that this seam was where all marine life concentrated, because fish were driven from the toxic waters, so fishermen were forced to fish along that seam. And that seam was the direct route between Taiwan and the Philippines. The researcher says Vishnu led survivors in Asia to salvation in his iconographic fish, the Philippines and Indonesia, and that the fish avatar of Vishnu is not apparent in the contours of the islands themselves, but obvious when the contours of the ocean currents are taken in combination.
So the mythology is a map, the god is a current, the fish is an archipelago.
That's the synthesis. And the researcher is consistent about this across traditions. The Shinto canon recalls the patriarch and matriarch as Izanagi and Izanami. The Hindu canon recalls them as Vishnu and Lakshmi. The Arabian canon recalls them as Noah and his wife. The Polynesian canon recalls them as Maui and his wife. Different names, different traditions, same event. The nobility of the Archaic led mankind back from the brink of extinction following the Super Eruption of 80,000 BC. Genetics alone, the researcher says, proves that to be the case.
And the researcher's contribution is Bukit Kelam. That's the specific geographic claim that this is where it happened.
Exactly. How do I know it was on Bukit Kelam that Izanagi and Izanami witnessed fire and ice conspire to end their world? Because I have maps. That's the researcher's answer. And it's either the most audacious claim in the history of human origins research, or it's the most important one. Possibly both.
I want to push back slightly on one thing, because I think it's worth naming. The researcher is publishing anonymously under an unknown soldier. This is not peer-reviewed academic work in the conventional sense. How should listeners hold that?
It's a fair and important question. The researcher is explicit about this tension throughout. There's a recurring frustration with what's called accredited academia. The researcher argues that if a skeptic proclaims a hypothesis, they're a genius, and if an amateur does the same thing, they're dismissed. The research has been submitted to antiquities authorities in the UK and Spain. The researcher invites people to open Google Earth and verify the cartographic claims themselves. The methodology, soloromancy, the azimuth technique, is described in enough detail that it's replicable. Whether the conclusions hold up to formal scrutiny is a separate question, but the invitation is to let your eyes be the judge.
And there's something genuinely interesting in the researcher's point that the major world religions all agree on the catastrophe. That's not nothing.
It's actually one of the stronger threads in the argument. The researcher says, on this catastrophe, all the major world's religions agree, and in that agreement we realize one essential fact regarding the family of mankind. We all share a common origin in this near-extinction event. Science and religion both agree mankind began in an idyllic cradle and descend from a single father and mother. The disagreement is over the disaster narrative, and the researcher's position is that dismissing the disaster narrative as superstition, when it appears in every major tradition independently, requires more explanation than accepting it.
There's also a real stakes argument here that the researcher makes about what's being lost. ISIS destroying ancient iconography in northern Iraq and Syria because they believe it to be idolatry. The researcher's response to that is striking.
Yes. The researcher says, an idol is only an idol as long as you think it's an idol. Once you realize archaic iconography for what it is, graven images recording geology, it is nearly impossible to go back to believing it is an idol. These iconographs represent the geology of dominions, and in that sense they represent the individuals who lived in the age they represent. At best, in Christian understanding, these iconographs represent saints. The argument is that the destruction of these artifacts is the destruction of humanity's oldest written records, not religious objects, documents.
That reframe has real implications for how we think about heritage preservation globally.
Enormous implications. And the researcher makes a pointed argument about the people of Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Australia, New Zealand, and Polynesia, their descendants. The researcher says that in branding everyone living in the Indonesian archipelago as small-brained primitives incapable of complex cognition, academic consensus is effectively branding every man, woman, and child in those nations and their diaspora. The truth the research reveals, the researcher says, is that the nobility of the archaic were brilliant, loving empiricists with a deeper commitment to the commonwealth of mankind than many institutions can perceive today.
That's a genuinely important point. The stakes of getting this wrong aren't just academic, they're about whose ancestors get credited with intelligence and civilization.
Exactly. And the researcher's framing of the Dayak as the originators of a global writing system, a global navigational tradition, and the oldest continuous religious festival is, in that sense, a reclamation. Whether or not every specific claim holds up, the broader argument that Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander civilizations were far more sophisticated than conventional history credits is one that a growing number of researchers are beginning to take seriously.
So when you step back from all of this, the eruption, the sundogs, the island hopping, the maps encoded in tattoos and robes and stone carvings, what does it actually come down to?
It comes down to memory. The researcher's core argument is that what we call mythology, what we call religion, what we call art, these are all forms of memory. Memory of a catastrophe so total that it nearly ended our species. Memory of the people who led survivors through it. Memory of the day the sun came back. And that memory was encoded not in words, because words are local, words are tribal, but in a visual language based on the one thing every human being on Earth shares, the shape of the land beneath their feet and the path of the sun above their heads.
A writing system that doesn't need translation because it's written in geography?
That's it. And the researcher's point about Egypt upgrading to Twitter while her neighbours remained with conventional mail is a useful frame. Egypt invented hieroglyphics, a phonetic system, and those conversations were preserved. Europe, Arabia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, they stayed with iconographic writing, and those conversations were obscured. This research is an attempt to read what was obscured.
And Diwali sits at the beginning of all of it. The Festival of Lights is, in this framework, the oldest act of collective memory our species has.
The researcher says it plainly. The day the sun finally blazed through the haze of Toba's volcanic winter, the survivors witnessed a divine sign of redemption and rebirth from the summit of Bukit Kalam. That day became mankind's oldest continuous religious festival. The name of that festival is Diwali. Every lamp lit during Diwali today is, in this framework, a reenactment of that first moment of light after a year of darkness. It's not a metaphor for good over evil in the abstract. It's a memory of an actual year when the world went dark, and then, against all odds, the sun came back.
Here's what this really comes down to for me. We started this episode with a supervolcano and 26,000 people clinging to survival on a handful of islands. And what this research traces is how those people didn't just survive, they built something. A writing system, a navigational tradition, a way of encoding the shape of the world into the objects they wore, the tattoos on their faces, the carvings they left on stone. And they encoded the most important day in their history into a festival that 1.4 billion people still celebrate every year.
And the actionable insight here, if there is one, is to look again. Look again at the things you've been told are primitive, or superstitious, or merely decorative. The researcher's invitation is to open Google Earth, find the geology, and see if the iconography matches. Let your eyes be the judge. Because if this research is even partially correct, then the oldest written records in human history are not in Egypt or Mesopotamia. They're on the faces of Maori elders, on the shields of Dayak warriors, on the robes of Bedouin kings, and on a patterned stone buried under a mound in Wales.
We open this episode with a volcano plunging the world into darkness. And here's the thing. The people who survived that darkness didn't just wait for the light. They watched it, they recorded it, they built a language around it, and they passed it down for 80,000 years. The next time you see Diwali lamps lit, whether it's in a window in Mumbai or a community center in London or a photo on your feed, you're looking at the oldest act of remembrance our species has ever performed. That's not a small thing.